Now to a landmark climate change lawsuit. A group of young people successfully sued the government in Montana for failing to protect them from climate change.
The 16 youth argued Montana had shirked its constitutional obligation to protect and maintain a clean and healthful environment for them and future generations by refusing to assess the impact of greenhouse gas emissions.
The judge found the plaintiffs have a fundamental constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment, which includes climate as part of the environmental life support system.
Aged 5 to 22 years old, they won the first youth-led climate trial in the U.S.
You are listening to Climate Court Voices, a podcast where we speak with the individuals leading crucial climate lawsuits and championing environmental justice efforts worldwide. In this episode, we speak with Rikki Held, the lead plaintiff in a landmark youth-led court case challenging the U.S. state of Montana and its permissive approach to approving fossil fuel projects. Rikki and the 15 other young plaintiffs prevailed, and their victory was called the strongest climate change win in any court in the world.
My name is Rikki Held, and I was involved in the Held versus Montana youth climate lawsuit. We filed that lawsuit in 2020 and concluded it in 2024. I was one of the 16 plaintiffs. We filed this lawsuit against our state of Montana for violating some of our constitutional rights by contributing to the climate crisis through supporting a fossil fuel-based energy system.
The case was brought by Our Children's Trust, a non-profit law firm beyond several youth-led climate lawsuits against US states and the federal government. It was filed in March 2020 on behalf of 16 plaintiffs aged 2 to 18. The lawsuit challenged the state of Montana's historic and ongoing activities to permit fossil fuel expansion and production, and specific laws that prohibited the state from considering climate change and greenhouse gas emissions when determining whether or not to issue permits for fossil fuel projects. Greenhouse gases are the primary drivers of climate change. They're caused by human activities. First and foremost, the burning of fossil fuels, but also deforestation, livestock production, fertilization, waste management, and industrial processes. Scientists have linked climate change to more frequent and more severe extreme weather events, including hurricanes, floods, heat waves, and droughts, as well as sea level rise and coastal erosion resulting from warming oceans and glacial melting. It is also directly impacting the livelihoods and health of millions of people around the world. Growing up on her family's 7,000-acre cattle ranch in the US state of Montana, Rikki witnessed some of these impacts firsthand.
Growing up on the ranch, even in my short lifetime, I've seen different changes. For example, we've had increased drought, increased wildfires, and we've had some wildfires on our ranch, but also just ones in the area that, of course, affects air pollution with the wildfire smoke. We get advisory warnings in the summer all the time saying that you shouldn't be outside. I've seen ash fall from the sky. And so we've seen those impacts or wildfires, they've burnt down power lines, and that affects us getting power. That affects us being able to water our cattle in the hills. And so with things like drought and not having electricity, then our cattle in the hills, they have longer to travel between the water tanks and the feed out in the hills. And then if you aren't able to pump water up into the hills, then they have to go all the way down to the river bottom and back up. And so that really affects the health of cattle. We've had some starve to death and get really thin because they can't make that trip. And, people in the area have had to sell their cattle in years like that because it's changing. So, 1 year you have drought and maybe you can feed and overgraze a bit. And then the second year you have to overgraze and then there's just no grass. And the third year you don't even get enough water for that grass to come back and you just have to sell your cattle. There's been more water variability in the Powder River, and the river next to us. And some years that's really affected irrigation, like late in the summer, there's not even high enough water levels to irrigate. It's even dried up 1 year. We have reservoirs in the hills that ranchers have relied on for generations, and that fills up from snowpack in the winter, and then it lasts even into March and early summer, and then the water stays in the hills even into the summer, so that cattle don't have to travel as far between water tanks in these miles of hills. But those reservoirs aren't lasting through the summer, and so that's another water source that's gone. We've had also flooding with our river because with just high temperatures, abnormally high temperatures, in January or something, they've caused just like the breakage of ice and flooding, and that's affected cattle. We even had some bulls stuck out in the river on some ice, and then there's just really quick flooding, and then it got them stuck out there. And Dad had to get a log skidder and get out and feed them on the ice, which is completely dangerous, and you just have to keep working on those things. With extreme heat, like in 2021, we had 2 or 3 days at 110 Fahrenheit. And just these extreme heat days, those record-breaking temperatures for our area. And, as a rancher, you can't just stay inside. You have to protect your cattle and your livestock and your livelihood. And if there's smoky days and there's alerts saying air pollution or extreme temperatures, you have to keep working through it. And so, yeah, I've worked out on the ranch, like building fence or whatever, and you can't stop. So you don't have other options. We've also had more extreme weather events, such as hailstorms that have damaged crops, strong wind gusts that have tipped over the end of our pivots, which is our irrigation system. That completely affects our operation, and it's expensive. And yeah, this is our livelihoods.
What Rikki experienced are the impacts of climate change, and there is indisputable evidence that the fossil fuel industry is fueling it. And yet their states seem to ignore it. Rikki's lawyers contended that the state's long-standing conduct of approving fossil fuel projects was resulting in dangerous levels of greenhouse gas pollution that were exacerbating climate harms in Montana, including wildfires, extreme floods, droughts, and various health issues for the plaintiffs. By doing this, they argued, they were violating the plaintiffs' right to a clean and healthful environment, a right enshrined in Montana's constitution. To better understand just how meaningful the case was, I spoke with its lead attorney, Nate Bellinger.
My name is Nate Bellinger. I'm a senior staff attorney at Our Children's Trust, and I was the lead attorney on Held v. State of Montana, and I'm also a co-counsel on our Lighthiser v. Trump case, our federal litigation, and I worked on various state cases in addition to the Montana case, including cases in Wisconsin, Virginia, and some other ones as well. Montana was a really strong case for a few reasons. I think one of which is there's a strong constitutional right in Montana to a clean and healthful environment that was helpful for the case. There's also a lot of fossil fuel activities in Montana, so we had strong kind of evidence to support our claims that Montana's role and activities were really significant in exacerbating climate change.
The case became even stronger when it went to trial in June 2023. It was the first climate-related constitutional law case and the first youth-led case in the country to reach trial, attracting international media attention. Over the course of a week, the prosecution was able to present evidence not only from the young plaintiffs, but also from scientists and climate experts.
It ended up being a 7-day trial. Each party was given a week to put on their case. And so we took the first week. I think when we walked out of court at the end of the first week, we just felt really good about the testimony that we had heard and presented over the week. We had this really nice rhythm where we had plaintiffs testify, and then we had an expert testify. And so, for example, if you have Rikki Held talking about drought and wildfire impacts on her family's ranch, her testimony was followed by climate scientist Dr. Stephen Running, who's one of Montana's leading climate scientists, and he could explain how the drought and the wildfires and the heat that Rikki was experiencing is caused by climate change. It's being made worse from fossil fuel pollution and defendants' conduct. So it was a really nice week where we kind of wove the plaintiffs' stories together with the expert testimony. And it just went really, really well. And I just also want to emphasize too that while the case was, in part about proving how climate change and fossil fuel pollution is harming Montana and harming the plaintiffs, it was also important that we presented kind of what's possible for Montana. So we had an expert testify about how Montana can meet all of its current and future energy needs with 100% renewable energy. And in doing so, they would save the state and the residents about $30 billion a year. in energy and climate costs. So we really wanted to make sure that it wasn't just all about the bad things that are happening, but climate change, but also, the alternative future that's possible and necessary in order to protect the plaintiffs' constitutional rights.
By stark contrast, the state's defense was remarkably thin, calling only 3 witnesses, 2 high-level officials from one of the defendant's agencies, and a free market economist whose cross-examination overshadowed his testimony. The absence of any scientific experts or presentation of climate science was immediately noticeable.
The state ended up calling 3 witnesses. They testified very briefly, and they didn't dispute any of the facts. So that's the nice thing about these cases. I mean, the facts of climate change and climate science and the public health injuries, you can't dispute them in a courtroom. I mean, people can say whatever they want outside the courtroom, but inside the courtroom, when you have rules of evidence and standards and perjury, the defendants couldn't bring forth any experts to dispute our factual allegations and the testimony of our expert witnesses. So really their only defense was, we're just kind of doing what the law tells us to do, and the law says we can't consider greenhouse gas emissions, so we won't consider greenhouse gas emissions. But that actually kind of helped us in a sense, because they also admitted that if the laws we were challenging were declared unconstitutional, they could consider greenhouse gas emissions and would consider those in making permit decisions.
In August 2023, Nate, Rikki, and the other plaintiffs won their case against Montana. The judges ordered the state to consider greenhouse gas emissions and their impacts in its permitting process.
It took a few months after our trial in the summer to get a ruling, but the district court, Judge Kathleen Seeley, she ruled in our favor. It was wonderful. I was out camping. I had to get a permit, so I came back down and was logging onto Wi-Fi, and then I got the notice. They were going to have, just in a few minutes, our briefing with our whole team. And so I logged on and heard the news, and it was so exciting.
I think what the result of the case reveals is how important that evidence is and can be to securing strong judicial remedies. Because once the court was presented with all of that evidence from our experts and plaintiffs, the judge ended up ruling overwhelmingly in our favor, and declared that these laws we were challenging that prohibit the state from looking at climate change and greenhouse gas emissions when issuing permits for fossil fuel activities were unconstitutional. The court also found that the current level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are unconstitutionally degrading Montana's environment and natural resources and harming plaintiffs' health, and that each additional ton of greenhouse gas emissions makes those constitutional injuries worse. And that really sets the stage for what really needs to come next, which is the Montana needs to start actually reducing its greenhouse gas emissions to bring the climate back into stabilization and to protect the plaintiffs' rights. It's a 100-page district court decision, and about 20 pages of it detail the harms that the plaintiffs are suffering, which I know is really meaningful for the plaintiffs to know that the court really heard their testimony, because the majority of the plaintiffs testified, and to have that court order reflect what they were testifying about in court and their injuries was really meaningful for the plaintiffs.
Montana was quick to appeal the decision to the Montana Supreme Court, which ruled on the case last December. The judges rejected the state's arguments and instead completely affirmed all aspects of the district court's decision. It became the second Supreme Court in the US to hold that there's a constitutional right to a stable climate system.
The Supreme Court completely affirmed all aspects of the district court's decision, and the court also rejected this argument that we see a lot in climate cases, which is, it doesn't matter what Montana does because climate change is a global problem and everybody needs to act. And the court rejected that and said, just because climate change may be a global problem, Montana still needs to do its part to comply with its constitutional obligations. And they had some kind of colorful language about, Just because everybody else is jumping off the bridge doesn't mean you should too.
Since the Supreme Court's verdict last December, a lot has changed in the US.
A major focus of our fight to defeat inflation is rapidly reducing the cost of energy. The previous administration cut the number of new oil and gas leases by 95%, slowed pipeline construction to a halt, and closed more than 100 power plants. We are opening up many of those power plants right now.
Donald Trump, who has repeatedly denied and downplayed the climate crisis, was sworn in as the country's 47th president in January. Between then and now, his administration has ramped up efforts to dismantle climate policy at home and abroad. The Trump administration has shocked America and the world with the speed at which he has overturned much of the country's progress on climate, building on his campaign promise to drill, baby drill, and unleash American energy.
As you've heard me say many times, we have more liquid gold under our feet than any nation on earth, and by far. And now I fully authorize the most talented team ever assembled to go and get it. It's called Drill, Baby, Drill.
The administration has erased all references to climate change, global warming, and environmental justice from federal websites and official records, and halted work of the National Climate Assessment, the most comprehensive source of information about how climate change affects the US. With this move, the government is denying millions of Americans their right to access information that could, in some cases, quite literally save lives. Trump has also directed the US to withdraw from the Paris Agreement for a second time. He has opened more areas to oil and gas exploration and has rolled back dozens of environmental rules, including those regulating pollution from vehicles and power plants, national air quality standards for particulate matter, emission standards for industrial air pollutants, and wastewater discharges for oil and gas extraction facilities. Scientists say these rollbacks will leave the nation sicker and its air, water, and soil dangerously contaminated.
I've been in Kenya with the Peace Corps for the last 2 years, but still obviously watching what is going on in the US. And pertaining to climate change specifically, it is really scary that we're pulling out of agreements with other nations, and our government is now working toward expanding fossil fuels. And we know that this is the wrong way to go, and it's just going to keep increasing greenhouse gas emissions, contribute to the climate crisis. It's been really frustrating, and especially I want to go into the sciences and the earth sciences, and I plan to attend or start grad school next fall to get my PhD in studying climate change and earth sciences. So yeah, it's really pretty terrifying right now. And this is scary as someone who wants to go into the sciences. Funding is being cut, and if your government system doesn't care about the science, that's pretty scary because you need that information to make decisions and keep people safe and help people. And we need places like NSF that gives science funding, or NOAA with really important, it needs to predict climate change, and it also gives weather information that even industries like with airplanes, they need that information to be able to fly. And it's just basic information that plays into daily life. And so to have your government opposed to that is quite scary.
In April, Trump signed 3 executive orders to bring back coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, and an industry in decline globally.
Today, we're taking historic action to help American workers, miners, families, and consumers. We're ending Joe Biden's war on beautiful, clean coal once and for all. And it wasn't just Biden, it was Obama, and there were others. But we're doing the exact opposite. I call it beautiful, clean coal. I tell my people never use the word coal unless you put beautiful, clean before it. Right, Doc? So we call it beautiful, clean coal. Beautiful, clean coal.
This June, our Children's Trust filed a motion for preliminary injunction, urging the court to immediately halt the implementation of the 3 executive orders. The case was filed on behalf of 22 young Americans, including Rikki.
So the Lighthiser v. Trump case is a federal lawsuit. So we are challenging 3 of President Trump's executive orders that are designed and having the effect of unleashing fossil fuels, so increasing U.S. fossil fuel extraction, burning, transport, export. They are also at the same time really blocking and stopping the build out of renewable energy, which has been going, full speed ahead until recently. And at the same time, they are really dismantling and obstructing the climate science research and studies that are done both at the federal level and with federal funding and universities and other institutions. So we've argued that these executive orders and the way they're being implemented by defendant agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, are violating plaintiffs' federal constitutional rights under the Fifth Amendment to life and liberty. We've presented evidence about how these executive orders are, really driving up U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, increasing localized air pollution, all of which have direct and immediate impacts on plaintiffs' health, the longevity of their lives, their safety, and these impacts are being felt right now. These executive orders are having immediate impacts on the plaintiffs' lives.
In a rather unusual move, in July, the state of Montana, 18 other states, and the U.S. territory of Guam filed a motion to intervene in the Lighthiser v. Trump case. The coalition of states, which is led by Montana, is seeking to join the lawsuit as defendants to Trump's sweeping orders.
That was quite an interesting development. We did some research on this, and the Trump administration has been sued hundreds of times since taking office, and this is the only case where a coalition of states have decided to intervene and help the Trump administration defend the case. So what we make of that is they're worried, and they see this case as a threat to their intent to continue to unleash fossil fuels. So in that sense, it tells me we're on the right track. They're worried, and we're prepared to deal with the consequences of their intervention. They were granted intervention. They did not actually call any witnesses at the preliminary injunction hearing, again, because I think the facts are just so overwhelmingly on our side. It's hard to deny the science at this point.
On October 15, just a day before this podcast was meant to go out, a federal judge in Montana dismissed the lawsuit. Judge Dana L. Christensen wrote that he had reluctantly made the decision, despite convincing evidence presented by the plaintiffs during a 2-day hearing last month, where they seek preliminary injunction to have Trump's orders blocked immediately pending the ultimate resolution of the case. The judge said the suit was too broad in scope and asked the court to do something it wasn't designated to do: create and monitor national environmental policy. The case, he said, lacked the legal basis because the harm the plaintiffs described couldn't be fixed by a simple judicial decision. Our Children's Trust immediately announced that they would appeal Judge Christensen's decision. Julia Olson, chief legal counsel at Our Children's Trust and lead attorney for the plaintiffs, said, and I quote, "Every day these executive orders remain in effect, these 22 young Americans suffer irreparable harm to their health, safety, and future. The judge recognized that the government's fossil fuel directives are injuring these youth, but said his hands were tied by precedent. We will appeal because courts cannot offer more protection to fossil fuel companies seeking to preserve their profits than to young Americans seeking to preserve their rights. This violates not only the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent, but the most basic principle of justice." Unquote. The second Trump administration has profoundly tested the integrity of the US rule of law through a rapid deployment of executive actions that sustain institutional conflict. The administration has at times relied on novel and aggressive legal interpretations, which have generated hundreds of lawsuits and led to numerous court injunctions, with judges frequently criticizing the legal basis and factual claims put forth by the Justice Department. Despite the attacks, Nate agrees that the rule of law remains a powerful tool in the US and elsewhere.
I still believe in the rule of law. I still believe that in our constitutional democracy and in three branches of government, three co-equal branches of government, I know it's being tested right now by our current executive branch and to some degree our legislative branch as well. I think that underscores all the more the need for an independent judiciary. So we will continue to advocate that. I think more often than not, it is working. And I think when it's not working, there are high profile examples that get a lot of attention in the media. And when it works as intended, when courts tell the president to stop doing something and he does it, it doesn't always get the same level of attention. So I think things aren't necessarily quite as bad in terms of kind of the rule of law as you might think sometimes by following the news. But I do think we're at a really important time in climate change and in really democracy right now, where we need to really keep pushing both in the courts and in other fronts as well to do everything we can to kind of make sure climate change doesn't get worse and to ensure that constitutional rights are protected and abided by. And we really need everybody to step up right now and to do what they can to make sure that's the case. I do think also we're at a really exciting time in many ways with respect to climate change and renewable energy. Renewables, with the US possibly being an exception right now, unfortunately, but worldwide renewable energy is really taking off. I actually just saw today that for the first 6 months of 2025, there was more electricity generated from renewable energy sources than coal. That's the first time that's ever happened. So there really is a big global push towards renewable energy. The US was on that path, and hopefully we can get back on that path way soon. And even if you don't care anything about climate change, it's the cheapest form of energy today. So it just makes sense, and we just need to do everything we can to keep that going, both in the US and globally.
No matter how the case ends, one thing is undeniable. Youth are increasingly the driving force beyond climate litigation around the world, having transformed legal battles from technical policy disputes into powerful moral arguments for intergenerational equity. Dozens of cases were filed after Held v. Montana. Many of these have succeeded by compelling courts to acknowledge the scientific urgency of the crisis and hold governments accountable for their actions or inactions that disproportionately affect the young.
The Montana case was not the first case where where I or our Children's Trust have represented youth. We've been doing this work since 2010, and we represented dozens of youth in different cases. But the Held case in Montana was the first time where plaintiffs actually had the opportunity to testify in court and tell their stories, to the public and to a judge. So that was really meaningful and significant. And it's an incredible honor and privilege to represent these young people. A lot of them are dealing with some really tough things. They've had their homes flooded, they've had their homes, some of them burned down, they've been forced to evacuate. They've gone through some really traumatic experiences. And so we work closely with them to, really empower them to tell those tough stories in court and to do it in a way where they feel like they're doing it on their own terms, and it's empowering rather than re-traumatizing to them. So it's just an incredibly inspiring group of young people. They're all so committed to making the world a better place. It's just such a privilege to work with them, and it's a big responsibility and honor too, to make sure we do right by them, to do everything we can to protect their lives and their futures.
Stories like Rikki's remind us just how important it is to listen to what the youth have to say and what they're capable of when it comes to fighting for a cleaner future and justice for all. To fellow young people looking to get involved in the climate movement, Rikki has this to say.
The reason we kind of are starting these lawsuits and having us youth plaintiffs bring our stories out and being able to bring these cases is because youth are disproportionately impacted, and youth don't have a large say in our government systems. We don't have those positions of power to make these decisions. And, younger people and even future generations, they can't vote and have a say in this. I was 18 when we filed the Montana case, so I could, but largely we don't have a say, and we need our court systems to also stand up for us. And, we have our checks and balances, and that's what we need to rely on. So the executive branch can't have full power. And so we do need these court systems to say what is constitutional and help protect our rights and balance the other branches. And so, yeah, you need to use all of our forms of government, and that's supposed to have our checks on overreach. And so, yeah, I think that this is going to work. It's a slow process, especially through those court systems. We've been working on this a long time, but we are making changes, and even if it feels slow, so you have to, I always just say that, like, all you can do is what you can do, and you have to keep taking those steps forward, and you can't give up. And that's what people are doing, not just with climate change, but with everything, is you have to keep speaking out and focusing on your values and what you believe in to continue forward. It might seem overwhelming and you might not know where to start, but you just have to start somewhere and just, volunteer and change what you want to see and just go after that. So volunteer with different organizations, keep having conversations, learning as much as you can, and you just have to start somewhere. And it has been great having the support of our Children's Trust and being part of that bigger picture. And I think the scary part, I don't know, being involved with all of this, like, of course, I'm nervous. I want to say the right things and all that. But the scary part is really not doing anything and, being a young person and not having your government systems protect your rights. That's the scary part. And so being able to take action and do something, even if it's something small, that's what means something. And just know that you're not alone in this, and the burden isn't all on you. And there's so many people around the world doing wonderful things. And just also focus on what you want to focus on, whether you're a scientist or a writer or artist, or you want to be a lawyer or a judge or politician or even a rancher. All of these positions have their own role and can help do something. So just keep having those conversations and speaking out, sharing stories and talking with people in charge, like your representatives, because they need to hear from you, and what your story and what you have to say is also important, even as young people.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.